Thank you very much, Brendan. I thought it would be useful for me to start with a few excuses. First, I've, as a number of you may have been, suffering a bit from colds. I was okay on Monday, not too bad Tuesday, Wednesday, awful today. The Panadol and codeine, I think, are kicking in, but I'm hoping my voice will hold up. The other thing, slightly ironically, for a talk about food is I'm on, I think this is week 6 of the fast diet, when I spend 2 days of every week abstaining from most food, which means I had a boiled egg at 7 o'clock this morning, so I'm getting a little bit peckish now, and the prospect of talking about healthy, nutritious food may cause some rumblings, which I hope won't be picked up by the sound recording or can be edited out later. The third thing is that the title, a colleague of mine, you may have detected that I wasn't born and brought up in Australia. I'm in fact Welsh, but I have a UK passport. And she saw the advert for this talk the other day and sent me a discreet little email saying, "Paul, you do know what rooted means in the vernacular Australian, don't you?" I haven't yet replied to her. I thought it'd be better to reply face-to-face rather than through an email that might get picked up by the university's censorship system. But I said, well, if I wasn't going to call it this, the alternative would be unprintable in a public event and unspeakable in a public event. But I am vaguely conscious of the alternative meanings of the term. And finally, as Brendan said, I'm scheduled to speak for 30 minutes. I always say that I'd like to speak for a bit less, but if you've had any encounters with academics, you'll know that our conception of time is slightly different to most people's, and that 30 minutes to me is probably 45 minutes on your watch. But I will attempt to be brief so that there is plenty of time for our discussions. So that's the subtitle, if you like. Planning for greater urban food security in the face of climate change. I won't say a lot about climate change. I'm certainly not going to try and persuade you that it's real, tangible, and a significant threat to us. I'll take that as read. I will focus a bit in what I say on planning, because I'm a planner. I studied, qualified, and practiced as a town planner in the UK many years ago, drifted a bit away from urban planning or town planning over the intervening decades, but returned my focus to urban planning when I moved to Australia 6 years ago. What I'm going to be drawing on is some research that we completed recently. In fact, Nick was part of the team that did that, looking at urban food security in Australian cities in the face of climate change. So that's kind of informing what I'm saying and providing a bit of a background. What I want to do, though, is to start by telling you a bit of a story to illustrate what I think is an important issue in this whole process. Now, in case you don't immediately recognise these people, these are the Ashmore community gardeners. They're from Ashmore on the Gold Coast, which is where I'm based. I work at Griffith's Gold Coast campus. And when we were doing this research on urban agriculture and food security in Australian cities, half of our research entailed a fairly systematic review of the literature, fairly current, the last 10 years literature. And then we wanted to take some of the key issues that we found from that literature and explore them in a bit more depth through some face-to-face interviews and group discussions with people on the Gold Coast and indeed in Melbourne. So we picked a couple of case study areas. The Gold Coast, obviously, because most of us, or the project was based there, and Melbourne because we had the view that there was quite a lot of interesting stuff going on there. Anyway, in the course of, and Nick did all the Melbourne field work for us. I did some of the Gold Coast work, and one of the projects that we spoke with was or a representative of the Ashmore Community Gardeners, and she told us their story, and I just want to share that with you because I think it's a bit symptomatic. If you go back probably 5 years now. A group of people on the Gold Coast thought that it would be a good, living in the Ashmore area, in that particular suburb, thought it would be a good idea to try and set up and establish a community garden. They thought this sounded like a good idea. Gold Coast City Council had a policy that supported the development of community gardens. They had an officer to support that. I can't remember if they had them at the time, but now you can go online and download a PDF brochure, a couple of brochures that talk you through the process of setting one up. So they thought, okay, this is what we'll do. Council are supportive. This should be fairly straightforward. Their community garden support officer, and I think in the intervening years there have been a number of people filling that position, which tells you something, said, well, the first thing you need to do is to establish yourselves as a group, to form a steering group, which they did. A group of them got together and said, well, we're willing to form the core of this group. They were then told that they needed to incorporate. If they were to receive any financial support, they needed to incorporate, and that there was a formal process to go through. Again, I'm sure you will all, or most of you, be aware of the joys of that process. They were also told that rather than doing that and incorporating in their own right, they could, if they wanted to, go down the slightly easier route of existing under the auspices of an already existing relevant body. So they thought, this sounds like a quicker, easier way, so we'll maybe try that. And they cast around for groups that they might, under whose umbrella they might shelter. They found a particular group, went through that process of joining, getting themselves kind of mentioned under the constitution of this group and everything else, and then were told, unfortunately, by council that actually the group under whose umbrella they had chosen to shelter were not sufficiently relevant to their aims and objectives and purposes, so they couldn't go under their umbrella because it was an inappropriate umbrella. So they went back to square one and started the process of incorporating themselves again. So that took a bit more time. But they persisted and they were still enthusiastic and keen. They then got to the point where they started to look at and for sites. And again, their community garden support officer was very helpful, identified a number of possible sites that they could consider. Some, but not all of which, were in existing parks, where the process would have been to annex a small corner of a park and turn that into a community garden. So they looked at the ones that were suggested to them, discussed amongst themselves which would be most appropriate in terms of the kind of location, what they were looking for, proximity to most of them and so on, picked one, and started then having some initial ideas about how they might plan and lay out this particular site for what they wanted. It was then that they were told, again, unfortunately, by the council that that site was no longer available. They weren't, I don't think, told the precise reasons why it was no longer available, but it was no longer available. So they said, well, okay, tell us what is available still. And they were told, and they looked, and they selected. And again, they went through that process of starting to kind of sketch out how much land they needed, how they might use that particular site, and so on. They went quite a long way down that road before they received a communication telling them that, unfortunately, this was in the newly redrawn flood hazard map for the Gold Coast, and in the event of a Q100 flood event would be underwater, and therefore was inappropriate, not because they were particularly worried about the vegetables washing away, but because any structures that they might have erected on the site might have interfered with the water flows and the hydrology, and that was inappropriate and unacceptable. So they had to find another site. This time, by now they were getting a little bit peeved at some of the delays and the obstacles and the hurdles that they were facing, but they persisted. They then decided on a location, another site that happened to be within a park. Council said, well, the next thing is consultation with the local community. we'll handle that for you, don't worry, we're experienced and used to doing that. And they were, so they mailed residents in the surrounding properties to say that there was a proposal for a community garden, and they had an opportunity to express their views. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I don't know, some of the residents so leafleted were not that keen on having a community garden near their property. And when they held a public meeting to discuss this, this was organised by the council, the members of, not necessarily these particular individuals, but members of the embryonic Ashmore community gardeners turned up. They were subjected to, I don't know, a room with this many people in, most of whom were not pleased with what they were proposing, because they thought that it would destroy the value of their properties. They had, which is not surprising, on the Gold Coast, amongst their members, people who were involved in the property industry, who were able to speak with confidence about, the precise amount by which their houses would reduce in value if something as outrageous as a community garden was located in the vicinity. Everyone got quite animated about that, as you can well imagine. There was also concern about the hippies that this was going to attract in a kind of ecological sense, and of course the inevitable drug dealing that would be attracted to this community garden as well. As you can see, the typical members of the Ashmore Community Garden, unlike the images that you might see in the pages of the Gold Coast Bulletin when notorious drug traffickers and dealers are arrested, don't exactly conform to that stereotype. But they were subjected to some pretty unpleasant and sustained opposition from these local residents. And again, they had to move and pick somewhere else because they decided that this simply wasn't a battle that was worth having, trying to persuade such people that in fact having a community garden near them might be something that they would enjoy joining and participating in, that if anything they might be interested in some papers, including those written by some of my colleagues, that can show you that there are in fact increases in property values typically associated with green developments in residential areas, but they decided that that was a battle that they would walk away from. So, unsurprisingly, their numbers fell. They'd been in existence for a few years now. They were still no closer to having a garden of their own in their neighbourhood. They spent some time, when we were doing this work, they took some space in land managed by Gold Coast Permaculture and operated there. I was just checking their website earlier today, and they've now got a site in a local school, which is an excellent outcome. So this is why they're now smiling, happy group of people. The point of this story is that a group of enthusiastic local residents in what would appear to be a supportive policy environment struggled substantially to get what would seem to me, possibly to you, I don't know, we'll discover in Q&A afterwards, an unremarkable and rather positive proposal, but was seen by some people in one of the areas as the opposite. So I think what that exemplifies is not only the need, which I guess we all know, to have stamina and persistence and patience when you're doing anything like this, but that it can be really difficult even in an environment, a policy environment that is in theory supportive. And they did receive support from their local councillor. He happens to be a councillor who's made some slightly strange comments around other proposals for other forms of urban agriculture, suggesting that a relaxation of the bylaw that restricts the number of chooks you might keep on plots of certain sizes, if relaxed, would soon see a policy that required the compulsory possession of pigs by everyone, including high-rise residents of properties in Surfers Paradise. So they received support from him despite some of his slightly strange views. So they struggled a bit, and I think we should bear in mind that these things, and I will resist any attempt to develop a kind of gardening metaphor, but some of these seeds are falling on stony ground and take a long time to set and to germinate and to flourish. The next, it's not as long a story, you'll be pleased to hear, but just another little illustration from a place closer to my home. These are three guys. That guy is the head of something called not the head, but one of the leading figures in something, the Biospheric project in Manchester in the UK. What they have succeeded in achieving, and I'm not sure how long it took them from his initial thoughts to where they are now, but again, probably a few years. But they have succeeded in establishing in a pretty rundown area of Manchester, in a disused mill, alongside one of the most heavily polluted rivers in the city, and in an area where they, without too much difficulty, were able to identify apparently 67 not especially healthy fast food outlets within, I was going to say spitting, but kind of vomiting distance of their premises. They've converted this mill, previously derelict mill, into something that now has an orchard with 70 fruit trees. It has a worm farm. They engage in fish farming and some aquaponics. They've constructed a green wall on which they're growing salad. Not those, that's in obviously in one of their polytunnels. They've recently opened an organic whole food cafe, and they run a series of very successful tours for members of the public, interested members of the public, and schools, which I think demonstrates, again, what we probably know and suspect, which is that any initiatives like this attract a lot of interest to the extent that people are willing to go and sign up for tours to learn a lot more about them. What's interesting about this project is that it's being supported by quite a wide range of outside bodies, including, and they're using the whole exercise as a research project. He's doing a PhD, I think, at Manchester Metropolitan University, who are supporting it, as is Queen's University Belfast, as are Siemens, BDP Architects, and a major developer called Urban Splash. I'm not sure if they've come over, I think they might be operating or trying to operate in Australia. They were when I was in the UK, they were very successful at taking old redundant buildings and basically gentrifying them, turning them into usually fairly upmarket kind of residential schemes. They bought this mill, the old mill in Manchester, and have been sitting on it and are letting it to the Biosphere project at a peppercorn rent. What I think this illustrates to me is the commercial potential that far-sighted companies can see in projects like this. It shows to me the tremendous value, and we certainly saw it on the Gold Coast. I mentioned Gold Coast permaculture. They're occupying land that had been standing empty and derelict and overgrown for many years at a peppercorn rent from the owner, and have said, when you need it, give us 3 months notice and we're gone. You'll have a clear, pristine site. That's not a problem. In the meantime, we'll carry on using it. I think there's tremendous potential in using unused land and vacant buildings for these kind of purposes. And it shows, I think, also that that projects like this can be instrumental and effective in broader projects of urban renewal. Manchester has been on the receiving end of any number of urban policy initiatives, and I think this is a very good and successful example of something a bit, well, certainly when I was in the UK and looking at these kind of things, you didn't hear many projects like this. They weren't typical, but perhaps becoming more so. And as an example of local economic development. And certainly that would be one of my kind of take-home messages, which is that I think initiatives like this have great potential and need politically, as a matter of political strategy and tactics, to be sold as economically viable and beneficial projects, as well as projects that do good in a wider sense of the term. And then, sorry for a couple of UK examples, but the other one is from Bristol, which is the city that I lived in for over 20 years before I moved to Australia. I wasn't particularly aware when I lived there that this kind of work was going on, but it clearly was in a smaller scale. It's becoming much more organised, widespread, and impactful now. But what you have now in the city of Bristol, which is a city of about 500,000 people, hour and a bit train ride from London, west of London. A nice kind of middle-class city, didn't experience the same kind of industrial decline problems as Manchester, but still has pockets of significant deprivation and poverty. But what you've got there now is a food council. You've got a number of reports and products of research, including the Bristol Good Food Charter, and a movement that's pretty well coordinated and organised, which has a number of aims. I mean, they are about maximising the supply of food from the local region, by which they would mean about a 50-mile radius of the city centre. And that would take in some high quality and less high quality agricultural land. Maintaining a spread and a diversity of market opportunities and food outlets. Certainly when I was there recently, it was clear to me that a number of places are trading on the fact that they're offering locally produced, high quality, nutritious food, and they make a selling point of that and appear to be doing so successfully. They've also incorporated a kind of recycling, reuse and reduction of food waste component to their plan, and they, again, unsurprisingly promote quite strongly the principles of community engagement and public participation in all their work. And it seems to me that is something that is it's an area of activity where it's easier than perhaps some others to engage large and diverse numbers of people. And again, they see and are able to make a convincing case that's supported by research, which again they've got associated with this, that there are clear local economic development benefits, there are clear public health and dietary benefits, and there are clear community development benefits. Some of the things that have helped there are the fact that they have a supportive mayor. Now, the local government system in the UK is rather different, and directly elected mayors are a rarity. Bristol has recently elected for the first, chosen to go down the path of having a directly elected mayor, and he was elected, I think, in February of this year. They've always had Lord Mayors, but they were ceremonial people who wore robes and cut ribbons and kissed babies and met visiting dignitaries. They've now got an executive mayor similar to the type that we have here, and he is very supportive, which is good. They've incorporated a significant research element, music to the ears of people like me, but I think that means that they've always got good information to back up their claims and to support their arguments about beneficial impact. And including, I mean, they produced a very good and solid report called Who Feeds Bristol, which looked at current food system characteristics and supply patterns, and estimated that by using more or a lot of the available and appropriate currently unbuilt upon land within the city's boundaries, they could provide something about around 15 or 16% of the vegetable requirement for the local population. So, those are just some examples and some stories of how things are happening in Australia, but in other parts of the world. And you can find similar and similarly inspiring stories, certainly in the United States and Canada, in South America, and in a number of other European countries. So the question is, how are we travelling in this regard in Australia? Now, as I said at the outset, our research, funded by the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, which interestingly benefited from a cash promise in the week before the election from the new government, then opposition, to continue its funding should they be elected. So that's good, because we were looking at the demise of that organisation until a couple of weeks ago. NCAR funded the research that I mentioned, which, as I say, looked at what was going on in the Gold Coast and Melbourne as examples, but we recognise and acknowledge that there's a lot more going on in the places we looked at, but there are a lot more in the places going on in the places that we didn't look at. So in answer to that rhetorical question, how are we travelling, I would say that what characterises the Australian scene is one of complacency and a sense of irrelevance. I think that the complacency of the situation in Australia is characterised by a rather crude understanding and application of the notion of food security, where we say we are a food secure country because we produce a lot more food than we consume. We export it profitably, we're likely to continue to export it profitably, and indeed we are increasingly looking to the export of food to supplement the export of other things that come out of the ground in Australia that we export profitably, in a short-term use of the word. So I think I would use the word complacency because it assumes that we're okay. We enjoy a crude surplus in production. There is little acknowledgement and recognition in the National Food Plan, and I know those are three words that will get Nick going. There's little in there that suggests that there are problems with the distribution of food and the variable accessibility to nutritious and affordable food within the country, but there clearly are. So the complacency, I think, is born out of the fact that the National Food Plan, as a kind of exemplary approach to this question, is something that is almost entirely driven by and focused on the needs of producers. Now again, Robert will be able to tell us what it's like from a producer perspective, but there's little of the consumer perspective in that. And there's almost a kind of underlying assumption that all we want and need is a continuing abundance of cheap food. The cheaper the better. You know, if we can get milk down to less than $1 a litre, that's good. If you can go and buy a fresh chicken for, you know, under $3 or something, then how could it possibly get any better than that? And if we're opening more and more supermarkets, and the supermarkets are getting into smaller metro stores and starting to take over the corner shop market as well, then that's all for the best. As I say, there's also a view that you know, the burgeoning Asian, Chinese and Indian in particular, but I guess also Indonesian middle class market for Australian grown food is seen again as a salvation that will either add to or compensate for any kind of decline in shipping coal or iron or uranium. We're not entirely sure what will happen to the National Food Plan under the new government. I don't know if Nick might have some views on that. But I suspect it's something that they perhaps are not. They'll either consider it an irrelevance or get rid of it in the bonfire of the regulations. The irrelevance bit, I think, comes from what I see has become an unfortunate aspect when you talk about urban agriculture. I've got a PhD student, Victor Perez, who's looking at similar topics, and people said to him, those two words don't go together. So what you're doing and what you're talking about and what you're interested in is irrelevant. Agriculture is something that happens in the countryside, in rural and regional areas. We consume food in cities, we don't produce it. So the notion of urban agriculture is strange and should be left well alone. And again, I think that there are some serious problems with that kind of attitude. So, luckily, I think there are people, and perhaps represented here tonight more than in the population at large, there are people who would see threats to that complacency and that sense of irrelevance. and see and look with growing concern at a number of developments that affect food security in Australia, and in particular in Australian cities. And one can almost talk about the two synonymously, given that the vast majority of us live in cities. But there is clearly concern, and it's not just amongst people like us, if I can dare to assume that we have some similarities. But there is concern, obviously, about the market power of the Coles and Woolies, whether the increasing market share of Aldi is something to be celebrated or not, whether the fact that I've now got an IGA, a super IGA in North Tambourine, where I live, is a sign of progress or not. I'm not sure, but I think we're increasingly concerned, or should be increasingly concerned, at the dominance. I mean, you may have heard stories today that Coles are applying for a banking license. So not only you'll be able to borrow your money back from Coles, spend it in their supermarkets, buy their petrol, drink in their pubs, buy liquor from their bottle shops, and buy their petrol to drive around consuming like this. I think that's slightly concerning, even if you're put to one side the effect of their market position and dominance on farmers' livelihoods and mental health. So the idea that availability and the availability and the comparative cheapness of processed and fast food is all that matters, I think is worrying. I speak as the father of two now teenage boys who, when they were little, would happily eat vegetables and all kinds of healthy foods, but now like nothing better than a couple of pizzas, meat lovers, washed down with a can of Mother, or if they're feeling a bit abstemious, just ordinary Coca-Cola, and see no problem with that, and indeed would welcome the construction of, as they did in North Tambourine, an outlet for Subway. Hurrah! Would welcome, no doubt, the construction of a new McDonald's at the bottom of the mountain at Oxenford, next to the Aldi, and would be delighted to have their pick of Pizza Hut, Noodle Box, or other places, and would not be at all concerned about the availability of fresh fruit and vegetables. Now, I don't think they're particularly strange in their attitudes and behaviour, but that's the generation that's coming through, who I think we, as we know, have to worry about. We know, in terms of the accessibility of fresh fruit and vegetables compared to processed foods, that we're becoming collectively and en masse less concerned, although perhaps there are some signs of a change in direction here about seasonality and localness, and we know that perhaps seasonality and localness are things we've got to pay for. And I think it's interesting, perhaps worryingly interesting, that the big supermarkets are trying to get into new forms of marketing, new forms of display and shop organisation to try and recreate perhaps some of the feel of the small independent stores, or trading off what appears to be the success of and growing interest in farmers' markets. But we know that a lot of poor people will say, if I haven't got a lot of money, I'm not going to spend it buying, and perhaps having to go a long way or go out of my way to inconvenience myself to buy healthy food when for $10 I can get a bucket full of something fried with gravy, fries and a fizzy drink quite easily. The other thing I think that we're becoming increasingly concerned about, or should be, is, although I don't think we've felt it too much in Australia, but that's the, if you like, the impact, the vicissitudes of global food markets and trading, futures trading in food, and what that does, what that can do to staples. I mean, I think certainly wheat prices will have irrelevance in Australia from a seller's point of view as much as from the consumer's point of view, but certainly in other parts of the world, what goes on in these kind of futures markets can have profound effects that have nothing to do with the productivity or the viability or the quality of people's product. It's to do with global gambling exercises by these traders. I don't probably betray my age, but those of you who remember a film called Trading Places might remember that pork bellies were the commodity that was traded by the protagonists in that film. So I think there is some growing awareness of the global and uncontrollable nature of those vulnerabilities. But a more parochial vulnerability is one that we experienced here a couple of years ago when the big floods hit and took out the Rockley market. We became acutely aware then of the vulnerability of particular nodes in our food distribution systems to being taken out of action even for a relatively short period of time. We became aware of what the practical implications of a 24-hour stocking cycle means. It means that when a market like that goes out, your shelves will be empty of fresh fruit and vegetables within 24 hours, and then we start going for the tins of baked beans and the dried pasta and everything else. We realise our exposure to those increasingly long global food supply chains. Now, I wouldn't say it's a paradox, but it's noteworthy, I think, that there is a view that food supply chains are actually quite resilient, notwithstanding occasional moments like this. But it's an area where a lot of expert attention is paid to maintaining. So the fact that we notice when something like this happens and that most of the time it doesn't happen shows that actually these systems are quite good at present at keeping that kind of just-in-time stocking system going. Now, the kind of disruptions that are likely to become increasingly common, so either global trading fluctuations and crises, the effect of extreme weather events, but also perhaps not here in Australia, but certainly in other parts of the world, the impact of war and conflict on those global supply chains is going, I think, to be increasingly significant. And of course there are political instabilities and episodes that crop up every now and again. So, if you're a beef grower in Northern Australia and suddenly the Indonesian market shuts down, or if you were, I can't quite remember what it was, kangaroo meat to Russia, or camels to Saudi Arabia, not necessarily for food, but there are various things that can happen that can have profound effects on the viability of some of our sources of production. And if you look at the rows, the political rows that go on about the importation of certain items of produce from New Zealand, for example, and the fact that those kind of biosecurity questions get caught up in global economic and political conflicts shows that we're exposed to some of these vulnerabilities. So what do we do instead? Well, I think we aim for greater resilience through processes of re-localisation. We're looking at smaller catchments for our natural resources, for water, for energy, but also for food, for jobs, for culture. Politically, this is part of a movement in response and reaction to the forces of globalisation, I think. But also I think there's an ecological awareness that localisation to a certain scale, and that's a point for debate and discussion and analysis, the scale at which you can sensibly and economically and plausibly relocalise is something to be discussed. But there's a recognition that there is strength and resilience in a degree to which you can build local capacity in any number of systems, including food. So what can planners do? As I said, I'm a planner, so what can we do to help build local resilience and in particular to strengthen local food security? For example, through supporting, if not promoting, urban agriculture in all its forms, and by that I mean both production, processing, distribution, as well as consumption and sale. Well, the first thing we can do, I think, is to learn from the past and from other places. So, as I say, it's not difficult to find really interesting and, in my view, stimulating and exciting examples of things that are going on in other countries and to learn from them. Some of them, it was an issue that we confronted actually in doing the research that I mentioned, that we wanted to look to some extent at what was going on elsewhere in the world, but we wanted to try and limit ourselves for a variety of reasons to what was going on in countries that were reasonably similar to ours, rather than in countries that were hugely different where people could just go, well, that may work in Nairobi, but Brisbane isn't Nairobi, so don't even bother telling me about it. You know, we might learn from Berlin instead, or be willing and able to. So we can learn from other places, and we can learn from the past as well, because of course the view that urban and agriculture are words that don't go together, and that food growing in cities is a strange concept, is nonsense. I mean, it's always gone on. It continues to go on. It may be less visible now than it has been in the past, but if you go back one or certainly two generations here, you'll see, you know, prolific examples of people providing for themselves from their suburban backyards, through, perhaps less so in this country and more so in places like the UK, from the equivalent of community gardens or allotments. And in times of stress and crisis, very successful conversion of parkland and any available open space to food production. It's what happened in the UK, in England during the war, when the German blockades of ships across the Atlantic meant that we had to basically dig up every bit of available land and dig for victory and provide for ourselves. So as I say, I'm a planner. We have a kind of statutory obligation to any presentation to include a picture of Ebenezer Howard's cover shot from Garden Cities, his Garden Cities book. So it still gets used quite rightly, because it's a very, you won't be able to read it from there. But it's a very good example of somebody's schematic representation of the ideal city. And I think it's interesting and noteworthy that the ideal city was a garden city. It taps into, I think, what's an enduring and positive aspect of our urban imagination, that cities can not only be full of concrete and bricks and tarmac, but also greenery, and that's what makes them good. It's an essential part of our image of the good city. And those are some allotments, as I say, which have always been a valuable part of urban life, certainly in the UK and here. We can also, I think, be and have an obligation to be imaginative and supportive. We need to be imaginative ourselves of possibilities, and to help others imagine different possibilities, and possibilities that we might want to make. Planners are often rightly criticised for coming up with blueprints that we say, well, here's the, this is the product of all our efforts, our thinking, our engagement and consultation and what have you. This is it, the blueprint, get on and make it happen now. And it rarely does, for a variety of reasons. But we need to think about futures, imaginative, exciting, different futures that we can imagine coming into being. And we need to infuse and enthuse our political leaders with that vision and imagination as well, including by tapping into popular imagination, because we, I think, find it quite easy, free as perhaps most or many of us are of those obligations of political office. And again, it's not difficult. If you kind of wander around Google Images, you'll find these types of images of what future cities might look like. There is a common and widespread theme, which is that the city will be, there'll be fancy architectural structures, of course, but there's often a lot of greenery involved, again, showing how nature and concrete entities can coexist. But perhaps I think here our greatest challenge is, and I speak as somebody, as I say, who works on the Gold Coast and spends a bit of time in the high-rise parts of the Gold Coast. It's not so much imagining a green high-rise future, it's reimagining a green suburban future. And I think that will be particularly challenging for us, because we're still wedded to this idea that quarter-acre blocks are commonplace and the norm, and they're not. If you look at the kind of things that are being built as suburban developments now, they're tiny. The lots are tiny and they're getting smaller. The houses are getting bigger. We might be keeping that in check a bit, but the lots are getting smaller. The only way we can deliver affordable housing at present is by shrinking everything down, including our backyards. I like to gently tease my Australian colleagues by saying that an obvious manifestation of the disappearance of your backyard is apparent for all to see on the cricket fields of England at the moment, where the future Warnes and Bradmans and Borders and so on have nowhere to practice and to hone their skills because they haven't got a backyard in which to do it. And if you were to try and do it on a street, you wouldn't last long before you're mown down by a yummy mummy in a four-wheel drive. And England are reaping the benefits of that at the moment for the time being. So finally, we need to plan without over-regulating. Again, I speak as a planner. We're very good at regulating and indeed over-regulating, but we need to think about our futures, to plan ahead and think about how we might get there, but we need to do so without limiting our future options. And I think we see that as the most pressing challenge when it comes to how we plan and regulate the land around our cities and how we deal with the pressure to enlarge and expand our cities, either by going upwards, by becoming more denser, or by spreading outwards. We've grown used to spreading outwards, and we've quite clearly and obviously done that at the expense of agricultural land. Not necessarily always high-grade agricultural land, but agricultural land or potential agricultural land nevertheless. So that's a big challenge for planning. We need to be imaginative in our planning without regulating our embryonic groups like the Ashmore Community Gardeners to the point that they give up, although thankfully they didn't. In that case, we'll be good planners. So those are some general observations. I'm sure that Robert and Nick will offer you some more practical proposals. If you have been, thank you for listening.